The clubhouse in Whispering Pines smelled of expensive coffee, cheap cologne, and absolute betrayal. It was just past 2 in the afternoon, but the heavy plantation shutters were drawn tight against the Florida sun, turning the space into a dim, air-conditioned theater. This was supposed to be a memorial. The invitation had called it a celebration of the legacy of Eleanor Whitaker. But looking around at the 60 or so faces crowded into the high-ceilinged hall, I knew better. This was a coronation. I stood with my back pressed against the cool stucco wall, my posture rigid. It was a habit I had never quite shaken after 6 years in the Air Force. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes scanning the perimeter. At my feet sat a small, nondescript black suitcase. It was fireproof and locked. To anyone else, it looked like I was just passing through, perhaps heading to the airport immediately after the ceremony. In a way, they were right. I was planning to leave, but not before I burned their entire reality to the ground. The room was stiflingly full. There were neighbors from every cul-de-sac in Whispering Pines, distant acquaintances I had not seen in a decade, and a handful of long-suffering residents who had been invited to fill out the crowd. In the center of it all stood Brenda Hargrove, the HOA president everyone called Karen behind her back but never to her face. She looked every inch the grieving but capable matriarch, dressed in a pastel pantsuit that cost more than my first car. Her hand rested heavily, possessively, on the shoulder of her son Derek. Derek was glowing. That was the only word for it. He did not look like a man who had just buried the community founder. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. His girlfriend, a woman named Madison, who had already started redecorating the clubhouse in her mind, was clinging to his arm as if he were a life raft made of pure HOA fines. Brenda's husband sat in the front row, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, looking between his wife and son with a gaze that screamed validation. I was the only one not looking at them with adoration. I was the glitch in their perfect neighborhood portrait. I was nearly 32, a data analyst who spent her days finding patterns in chaotic spreadsheets. And right now, the data was screaming. Friends, neighbors, Brenda began, her voice booming with that practice soprano she used at every board meeting. She gestured grandly to a large easel set up next to the podium. It displayed a glossy map of Whispering Pines with 7 distinct red stars marking the community amenities, the pool, the clubhouse, the 7 parks and greenbelts that generated the HOA's maintenance budget. We are here to honor Eleanor Whitaker. She built something incredible. She built the foundation for this community. She paused for effect. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the central air and the clinking of ice in plastic cups. And she would want that foundation to remain strong. Eleanor believed in tradition. She believed in order. That is why, in accordance with her wishes to keep Whispering Pines the envy of every subdivision in the county, I am proud to announce the future of this HOA. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the important residents, the ones whose opinions mattered to her social standing. She deliberately skipped over me. All 7 community assets and the full management contract, Brenda declared, her voice swelling with triumph, will be transferred immediately into the name of my son Derek Hargrove. He has been my right hand. He is the natural successor to the Whitaker legacy. The reaction was instantaneous. It was like a pressure valve had been released. The room erupted in applause. Men hooted and raised their iced tea glasses. Women leaned in to whisper congratulations to Brenda. Derek tried to look humble, hanging his head slightly, but the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth gave him away. Madison squealed, and buried her face in his chest, no doubt calculating the new fine revenue in her head. I did not clap. I did not gasp. I did not step forward to object. I just stood there in the shadows and I smiled. It was a small smile, barely a lift of the lips. This was my default expression for 30 years. They had interpreted my silence as agreement and my quietness as submission. They saw a resident who was low maintenance, the one who never complained about the absurd rules, the one who accepted the endless fines they tossed her way. They thought I was smiling because I was a good neighbor who was happy for Derek. They were wrong. I was smiling because I was the only person in the room who knew that the map on the easel was meaningless. Brenda basked in the applause for a long moment before raising her hand for silence. The room quieted down, expecting a toast. Instead, Brenda decided she needed one last ego stroke. She needed to address the elephant in the room, or rather the mouse in the corner. She turned her body toward me for the first time all afternoon. 60 pairs of eyes shifted to the back of the hall. I felt the weight of their stares, heavy with pity and judgment. "Now, I don't want anyone to think we have forgotten Avery," Brenda said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness that made my stomach turn. She chuckled, a low trill that invited the room to share in the joke. "But we all know Avery Thompson. She is the independent one. Always has been. She went off to the military. She has her little job in the city with her computers." She spread her hands, grinning at the crowd. "Our neighbor doesn't need handouts," she announced, delivering the final blow disguised as a compliment. "She can handle herself. She is a survivor, so she gets the gift of freedom from responsibility. Derek gets the burden of the assets." The room rippled with polite, knowing laughter. It was a cruel sound. It was the sound of a group of people agreeing that I was worth less and feeling virtuous about it. Brenda's husband nodded vigorously, mouthing the words "she's so strong" to a neighbor. They were rewriting history in real time, turning my disinheritance from community voice into a character trait. I kept my hands clasped in front of me. I did not flinch. I locked my knees to keep from shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice water in my veins. "Well said, Brenda." Mr. Caldwell spoke up. Mr. Caldwell was the HOA attorney. He had been handling Brenda's legal messes since before I moved in. He was a man of expensive suits and cheap morals, the kind of lawyer who bills you for the time he spent thinking about your case in the shower. He was standing by the podium, a thick leather briefcase open on the table in front of him. "If everyone is ready, Mr. Caldwell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I have the documents prepared to formalize the transfer. It is a standard filing executing the bylaws as Brenda has outlined. We can get the signatures done now and continue the celebration." He pulled out a stack of crisp white paper, the document that would legally cement Derek as the dictator of 7 community assets and the controller of millions in HOA dues. This was it, the point of no return. I took a breath. It was the same breath I used to take before analyzing a critical supply chain failure in a combat zone. Steady, controlled. I took one step forward. My heel clicked sharply on the tile floor. The sound was small, but in the anticipatory silence of the room, it was a gunshot. "Mr. Caldwell," I said. My voice was not loud, but it projected perfectly. It cut through the hum of the air conditioner and the murmurs of the guests. It was the voice of someone who used to give briefings to colonels. "Mr. Caldwell looked up, blinking as if a piece of furniture had just spoken to him. Brenda frowned, her smile faltering. Derek looked annoyed, like I was interrupting his victory lap. "Avery, honey," Brenda's husband hissed from the front row. "Not now." I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on the lawyer. I walked out of the shadow of the corner, dragging my small suitcase with me. The wheels rumbled low against the tile. I stopped 10 feet away from the lawyer, squarely in the center of the room, separating the crowd from the board. I looked at the papers in his hand. Then I looked up at his face. I let my small smile widen just a fraction, enough for him to see the steel behind it. "Lawyer," I said, dropping the honorific title, making the word sound like an accusation. You really don't know, do you? The question hung in the air. It was nonsensical to them. Of course he knew he was the lawyer. He had drafted the transfer papers. Mr. Caldwell froze. His hand hovered over the documents. A look of genuine confusion washed over his pale, doughy face. Excuse me, Avery. I'm afraid I don't understand. What is she talking about? Derek snapped, stepping forward. Avery, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself. No, I said, not looking at Derek. My eyes bored into Caldwell. I am asking your legal counsel a question. Mr. Caldwell, you have been billing Brenda for HOA planning for 20 years. You are about to read a document to transfer 7 community assets. So I am asking you for the record right now. Do you actually know who owns those amenities? The room went dead silent. The festive energy evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Brenda owns them, Caldwell sputtered, looking at Brenda for support. And through her power of attorney over Eleanor's estate, they are being bequeathed. Wrong, I said softly. Brenda. My voice stayed even. Avery, Brenda barked, her face flushing a dangerous shade of red. That is enough. You are ruining this afternoon. Whatever game you are playing, stop it. You get nothing. That is final. I didn't flinch at her anger. I had spent my childhood shrinking away from that tone. But I wasn't a child anymore. I was a woman with a suitcase full of evidence and a heart full of receipts. I am not playing a game. Brenda, I said, turning to face her. I am trying to save your lawyer from committing malpractice in front of 60 witnesses. I turned back to Caldwell. He was starting to look sweaty. He sensed it now, the uncertainty, the possibility that he had missed something. You didn't check the county registry this morning, did you? I asked him. You didn't check it last week. You haven't checked it in 3 years. Why would I? Caldwell stammered. Because if you had, I said, you would know that there is nothing to transfer. Somewhere to my left, a hand slipped. A champagne flute hit the floor. Crash. The glass shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. Champagne foamed across the polished tile. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody even looked down. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on me. Brenda had her hand over her mouth. Derek looked like someone had just punched him in the gut. Brenda looked ready to kill. The silence that followed the crash was heavy, physical, pressed against my eardrums. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. I could hear the shallow, panicked breathing of the lawyer. I looked at the crowd. I looked at the neighbors who had ignored me, the acquaintances who had dismissed me, and the board that had actively tried to erase me. They told you this was a legacy celebration, I said to the room, my voice calm and steady. They told you that today the Whitaker vision goes to the golden sun. They think I am standing here with nothing. I reached down and clicked the latches of my suitcase. The sound was loud and mechanical. Click, click. Let me tell you why today isn't going to go how they think, I said, lifting the lid. Inside lay 3 thick binders, organized, tabbed, and color-coded. But on top of them sat a single certified document with a gold foil seal from the county clerk's office. Brenda thought she was cutting me out of the community voice today. She thought she was making a grand statement. But you cannot cut someone out of a neighborhood they already control. What Mr. Caldwell didn't know, what Brenda didn't know, and what her son was about to find out the hard way was that Eleanor Whitaker hadn't just left me a token. She hadn't waited for death to decide who she trusted. She had signed the governing deeds over to a trust 3 years ago. And the sole trustee of that trust was not Brenda. It was not Derek. It was me. I picked up the document, the paper cool and smooth against my fingertips. I looked at Brenda, whose confidence was beginning to crack like a dam under pressure. We aren't here to read bylaws. Brenda, I said, We are here to read the rule change notices. To understand why I stood in that clubhouse with a suitcase full of rule change notices, you have to understand Whispering Pines. It was the kind of subdivision where lawns were measured in millimeters and success was measured in how loudly you could talk about it at the monthly potluck. The Hargroves were royalty here, not because they were billionaires, but because in a town built on moderate incomes, Brenda controlled the roofs over everyone's heads through fines. We were the model community. A polished president who chaired every committee, a husband who golfed, a son who was the star of the softball league, and a neighbor who, well, I was just there. I was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence about Derek. I was not an abused resident. I want to make that clear. I was never dragged before the board in handcuffs. I was never evicted. I never went broke. If you looked at the violation logs or meeting minutes, the Thompson household was spotless. My tragedy was not violence. My tragedy was silence. I was the homeowner who didn't need anything. So I got exactly that, nothing. The inequity started so early that I don't remember a time without it. It was just the atmosphere we breathed. Derek was 2 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, he was crowned the Prince of Whispering Pines HOA. Brenda loved to say that property management was a blood sport and she was training her gladiator. I remember my 10th birthday. I had asked for a telescope. I wanted to see things that were far away, things that were bigger than Whispering Pines. I came downstairs to a politely wrapped box containing a lawn edger and a calculator. Brenda kissed my forehead and told me that I was such a practical girl. She said I was growing so fast and I needed good tools for yard compliance. She said the calculator was because I was so good at math and I didn't need toys to be entertained. "You're smart, Avery," she said, smoothing my hair. "You don't need much. You're self-sufficient." 2 months later, for Derek's 12th birthday, they drove a brand new golf cart onto the front lawn. Cost nearly $2,000. I remember watching him tear up the grass while Brenda cheered and filmed it on her phone. When I looked at Brenda's husband, he didn't see the disparity. He just saw his son being happy. He saw the heir enjoying his kingdom. Brenda's favoritism was louder. It was a public performance. When we went to community events, she would rest her heavy hand on Derek's neck and introduce him to the other board members. "This is Derek," she would boom. "He is going to take over the empire one day. He has got the killer instinct." And then, if someone happened to look down and see me standing by her hip, she would add, "And this is Avery. She is bright. She will probably go off to college somewhere and find a nice office job." It wasn't an insult technically, but the subtext was clear. Derek was the legacy. I was a guest who would eventually leave. The pain of being invisible is a slow ache. It is not a sharp stab. It is the feeling of slowly fading out of a photograph. I learned to be quiet because when I spoke, nobody really listened. I learned to fix my own problems because if I asked for help, I was told that I was the easy one and I shouldn't complicate things. I became an expert at navigating my own life because the navigational charts of the neighborhood were all drawn for Derek. One memory stands out, sharp as a shard of glass. It was the spring of my 8th grade year. I had entered the regional science fair. I had spent 3 months building a complex model demonstrating soil erosion and structural stability in flood zones. It was detailed, data-driven, and frankly brilliant for a 14-year-old. I won first place. It was the biggest academic achievement of my life up to that point. The awards ceremony was on a Tuesday evening. I had reminded Brenda every day for a week. But that Tuesday happened to be the same day Derek had a scrimmage game. Not a championship, not a playoff, practice game. I stood on the stage in the school auditorium, holding my blue ribbon and a certificate. I looked out into the dark audience, scanning the rows of parents taking photos. I looked for Brenda's pastel suit. I looked for her husband's polo shirt. I saw nothing but empty seats where they should have been. When I got home, The house was loud. Derek had thrown a touchdown pass during the scrimmage, and they were reliving it over pizza. When I walked in, ribbon in hand, the room didn't stop. "Hey, kiddo," Brenda said, barely glancing up from her phone. "How was the school thing?" "I won," I said, my voice small. "First place." "That's nice," she said, scrolling. "Good job." That was it. No hug. No celebration. "No, I am proud of you." Later that night, Brenda's husband came to my room with a slice of grocery store cake. He sat on the edge of my bed and sighed. "I'm sorry we missed it, honey," he said. "But you know how important sports are to Derek. He needs our support right now. He is under a lot of pressure." He looked at my ribbon on the desk. "Maybe let's keep the bragging to a minimum tomorrow at breakfast," he whispered as if asking for a favor. "Derek played well, but the team lost. He is sensitive. I don't want him to feel bad that you won something when he is down." I nodded. I ate the cake. Tasted like ash. That was the night I realized that, in the Whispering Pines economy, my success was a currency that could only be spent if it didn't devalue Derek's ego. Board meeting conversations were a torture chamber of exclusion. We sat at the long mahogany table, but the dialogue was a straight line between Brenda and Derek. They talked about his ideas for new fines, which were average. They talked about his dates. They talked about his future in the HOA. "I think we should raise the flag fine to $200, Derek would say, puffing out his chest, repeating something he had heard Brenda say 1,000 times. "That's my boy," Brenda would beam, pointing her pen at him. "Smart." Squeeze the residents. If I tried to interject, if I tried to talk about my interest in architecture or mathematics, the air would leave the room. They would nod politely, give a generic, "That's nice, dear," and then pivot immediately back to Derek. "So, son, do you need new cleats for Friday? You're so independent, Avery," they would say when I stopped trying. "You figure things out. We never have to worry about you." They didn't realize that "we never worry about you" actually meant "we never think about you." But there was one person who saw me, Eleanor Whitaker. She lived in the original model home behind the clubhouse. She was the true source of the vision. The 7 community assets had belonged to her husband, and she had managed them with an iron fist in a velvet glove until her health began to slow her down. She was a small woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, while Brenda was busy turning Derek into a bully. Eleanor was quietly watching me. "You have the sight, Avery," she told me one afternoon. I was sitting on her porch reading a book while Derek was in the main yard loudly directing a landscaping crew Brenda had hired. "What sight?" I asked. "You see the cracks," she said, sipping her iced tea. "Everyone else looks at the paint, but you look at the foundation. You see what people are trying to hide." Eleanor started inviting me on her check-ins. Brenda took Derek on collections. There was a difference. When Brenda took Derek, it was about power. It was about showing up in the big golf cart, banging on doors, and reminding residents who owned the rules. It was about intimidation and the bottom line. Derek loved it. He loved the authority. He came back strutting, talking about deadbeats and compliance. But when Eleanor took me, we took her old sedan. We didn't go to collect fines. We went to see the people. A house is just wood and brick until a person lives in it, she told me as we drove to a small bungalow on the edge of the greenbelt. If you treat the property like an ATM, it will break. If you treat the resident like an enemy, they will destroy it. I watched her talk to Mrs. Higgins, a single mother who was late on her dues because her car had broken down. Brenda would have threatened a lien. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, drank coffee, and worked out a payment plan that spread the arrears over 6 months. "Look at the fence, Avery," Eleanor whispered to me while Mrs. Higgins was getting sugar. I looked. It is sagging. Not just sagging. The post is black. That means there is termite damage behind the panel. If we don't fix it now for $50, the whole section will rot out in a year and cost us $5,000. She taught me that HOA management wasn't about shouting. It was about listening. It was about data. It was about understanding the life cycle of a physical asset and the psychology of the human being living inside it. While Derek was learning how to be a bully, I was learning how to be a steward. I remember one sweltering July afternoon when I was 16. I was sitting on the steps of Eleanor's porch across the lawn near the clubhouse. Brenda and Derek were standing by Brenda's new golf cart. Brenda was clapping Derek on the back, laughing loudly at something he had said. Derek looked tall, broad-shouldered, and full of unearned confidence. He looked like everything a Hargrove was supposed to be. "Look at him," Brenda shouted, her voice carrying across the grass. "Born for this. He is going to double the portfolio in 10 years. I felt that familiar sting of invisibility. I was sitting right there 50 feet away and they didn't even glance in my direction. I was part of the scenery like the oak tree or the mailbox. Eleanor opened the screen door and stepped out. She leaned on her cane watching the two preen in the driveway. She didn't look impressed. She looked tired. She looked down at me. I must have looked pathetic, staring at them with longing and resentment. She sat down beside me, her joints clicking. She placed a cool, wrinkled hand on my knee. "It hurts, doesn't it?" she asked softly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Let them make their noise," she said, her eyes fixed on Derek. "They are loud. They are flashy. They think that because they are making noise, they are in control." She turned my face so I had to look at her. Her eyes were clear, fierce and conspiratorial. "You are quiet, Avery. And because you are quiet, they think you are weak. They think you are not there." She squeezed my knee. "But one day, you are going to learn that invisibility is not a curse. It is a weapon. When they don't look at you, they don't see what you are doing. They don't see what you are building." She looked back at Brenda and Derek, who were now high-fiving. "Someday," she whispered, a promise hanging in the humid air. "The fact that nobody noticed you is going to be the greatest advantage you have. They won't see you coming until you are already standing over them." I didn't fully understand her then. I just thought she was trying to make me feel better about being the overlooked neighbor. But sitting there on that porch watching the golden boy shine, I stored her words away. I filed them in the deep archives of my mind, right next to the structural integrity of flood zones and the cost of rotting fences. I didn't know it yet, but my education had begun. Derek was learning how to inherit a fortune. I was learning how to protect one. At 19 years old, I received a letter that I thought would change the dynamic of the neighborhood. It was an acceptance letter to a university 2 states away, accompanied by a partial academic scholarship. I remember standing in my driveway holding the thick envelope, feeling a surge of pride that I foolishly expected Brenda to share. When I told her over the next board meeting, Brenda didn't look up from her agenda. She took a sip of her iced tea and chuckled. "Well," she said, wiping her mouth, "finally, someone is going to clear out some of the clutter in the complaint folder." That was it. No congratulations, no questions about the program, just a joke about my absence being a convenience for her filing needs. A week later, I sat down with Brenda's husband to go over the finances. The scholarship covered tuition, but I needed help with housing and a specific advanced mathematics course I wanted to take over the summer to get ahead. The cost was about $3,000. He looked at the spreadsheet I had prepared. He sighed, the same weary sigh he used when the golf course was out of his favorite brand of scotch. "Oh, Avery," he said, sliding the paper back across the table. "We just can't right now. Derek has been scouted by a semi-pro league, and we need to upgrade his home gym. Professional equipment is incredibly expensive. You know." I stared at him. Sir, it is for math. It is for my degree. You're smart, he said, giving me that tight, dismissive smile. You can figure it out. Get a job on campus. You have always been so good at managing on your own. That phrase again, you can handle it. It wasn't a compliment. It was an abdication of duty. It was permission for them to ignore me while they poured every resource into Derek's athletic delusions. I looked at the clubhouse, at the expensive furniture, at the trophies lining the shelves in the boardroom. I realized then that staying in Whispering Pines was not just stagnant. It was suffocating. I didn't need a summer job. I needed an escape velocity. The next morning, I didn't go to the university registrar. I walked into a strip mall 3 towns over and sat down at a metal desk across from a man in a blue uniform. I signed the papers before lunch. I joined the Air Force not because I was a patriot and not because I wanted adventure. I joined because I wanted a paycheck that didn't depend on whether Derek needed new shoulder pads. I joined because I wanted to exist in a world where my address didn't mean the one who comes second. Leaving the neighborhood was anticlimactic. Brenda was at a meeting. Derek was at the gym. Brenda's husband hugged me at the door and told me to write, but his eyes were already drifting to the TV in the den. I got on the bus with a single duffel bag, and as the Welcome to Whispering Pines sign faded in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel sad. I felt light. The military was a shock to the system, but not in the way it was for the other recruits. They struggled with the yelling, the strict schedules, the lack of privacy. For me, it was a relief. For the first time in my life, the rules were the same for everyone. It didn't matter who your HOA president was. It didn't matter if you were the golden child or the invisible one. If your boots weren't shined, you got yelled at. If your bed was made perfectly, you got left alone. It was a meritocracy of discipline, and I thrived in it. I was assigned to logistics and supply chain management. It wasn't glamorous. It involved warehouses, manifests, shipping containers, and endless reams of paperwork. Most people hated it. They wanted to fly planes or carry rifles. I wanted to organize. I discovered my talent about 6 months in. I was reviewing a fuel requisition form for a transport squadron. It was a standard document, pages of numbers and codes. My eyes scanned down the columns and something snagged in my brain. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was a physical sensation, like a hiccup. Sir, I said to my commanding officer, pointing at line 42. This figure is wrong. He looked at it. That is the standard burn rate for AC 17 on a transatlantic flight. No, sir, I said. The flight log says they were carrying a light load. The burn rate should be 12% lower. This number matches a heavy load calculation from 2 months ago. It is a copy-paste error. We are over-ordering fuel by 15,000 gallons. He checked the logs. He checked the math. Then he looked at me with a mix of surprise and respect that I had never seen on Brenda's face in 19 years. Good catch, Airman Thompson, he said. From that day on, I became the unit's anomaly hunter. While my peers were complaining about boredom, I was dissecting the anatomy of bureaucracy. I learned that paperwork tells a story. Every invoice, every requisition, every inventory log is a narrative of human behavior. People are lazy. People cut corners. And when they try to hide things, they leave ripples in the data. I spent 4 years in a windowless room tracking parts for aircraft engines and meals for soldiers. I learned to spot a duplicate invoice from 50 paces. I learned that if a number looks too clean, too round, it is almost certainly a lie. I learned that the truth isn't in what people say, it is in what they sign. I went home on leave only twice a year. I stopped staying at the model home after the first visit. It was unbearable. Derek was working for Brenda full-time now, managing the amenities, which mostly seemed to involve driving around in a new golf cart and complaining about residents. Board meeting conversations were still the Brenda and Derek show. I told that guy in Unit 4 that if he didn't like the water pressure, he could move out. Derek bragged over pot roast. Showed him who is boss. Brenda laughed. That's right. Don't let them push you around. I sat there in my uniform, a staff sergeant who managed millions of dollars in government assets, and they didn't ask me a single question about my service. So I started staying with Eleanor in the original model home. Those visits were my sanctuary. Eleanor was getting older, her movement slower, but her mind was as sharp as a razor. She would make tea, and we would sit on her small patio. Tell me about the supply chain, she would say. Not how are you, but tell me how it works. I would explain the logistics of moving equipment across continents, the checks and balances, the way a single missing signature could ground a flight. She listened with an intensity that made me feel seen. Consequences, she said one evening, nodding slowly. That is what you are learning, Avery. In the real world, bad math has consequences. In this neighborhood, she glanced toward the clubhouse where the lights were blazing. They think math is just a suggestion. When my 4-year contract was up, my commanding officer offered me a re-enlistment bonus. It was tempting, but I felt like I had learned what I needed to learn. I had discipline. I had a skill set. And I had savings. I didn't need Brenda's approval anymore. I moved to Fairview City, a bustling metro area about 2 hours from Whispering Pines. It was close enough to visit Eleanor, but far enough that I didn't run into people who knew Brenda. I applied for a job at a firm called Valorn Property Analytics. It was a commercial real estate consultancy. They didn't buy or sell buildings. They analyzed them for investors. They were the people who told a hedge fund whether a shopping mall was a gold mine or a money pit. I walked into the interview with my military resume. The hiring manager, a woman named Sarah with glasses thicker than mine, looked at the logistics specialist title. We usually hire finance majors, she said. Why should I hire someone who counted airplane parts? Because finance majors look at the bottom line, I said. I look at the line items that make up the bottom line. I don't just see that you spent $10,000 on maintenance. I check if you spent it on 10,000 $1 screws or one $10,000 screw, and I check if the screw actually exists. She hired me on the spot. At Valorn, my education went from theoretical to practical. I wasn't tracking jet fuel anymore. I was tracking rent rolls, CAM charges, common area maintenance, and capital expenditure budgets. I learned the language of the wealthy. I learned what a revocable living trust was. I learned how a quitclaim deed could move a skyscraper from one shell company to another in 5 minutes. I learned how the rich used LLCs like Russian nesting dolls to hide their names from the public record. It was dry, tedious work, and I loved it. It was like solving a puzzle where the pieces were made of money. About 8 months into the job, I was auditing a portfolio for a client who was buying a chain of apartment complexes. The seller claimed the buildings were in pristine condition, justifying a high asking price. I was going through the maintenance logs for a building in Ohio. I noticed a pattern. Every month, there was a charge for emergency HVAC repair. The amount was always just under $500. In corporate accounting, $500 is often the threshold where you need a manager's approval. Anything under that, a property manager can just sign off on. I pulled the invoices. They were from a company called Rapid Air Fix. The address on the invoice was a residential house. I looked up the incorporation documents for Rapid Air Fix. The owner was the brother-in-law of the property manager. It was a kickback scheme. The manager was billing the building for repairs that never happened, keeping the charges small enough to avoid scrutiny and splitting the cash with his brother-in-law. Over 5 years, they had stolen nearly $30,000. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing screen. The realization hit me not with a bang, but with a slow, cold creep. I knew this pattern. I had seen these numbers before, not on a spreadsheet in a high-rise office, but on scraps of paper scattered on the kitchen table in Whispering Pines. I remembered Derek complaining about emergency pool repairs. I remembered him telling Brenda that he needed cash for a quick fix on the clubhouse roof. I remembered the way he would wave a handwritten receipt at Brenda, and Brenda would just wave him off, trusting him blindly. "Just handle it, son," Brenda would say. "I don't want to be bothered with the details." The details. That was where the devil lived. For years, I had assumed Derek was just incompetent or lazy. But looking at that fraud case on my monitor, a darker thought took root. Derek wasn't just bad at his job. He was smart enough to know that Brenda didn't check the receipts. My first thought wasn't about exposing them. I didn't care about Brenda's power. If she wanted to let her son rob the residence, that was her problem. But then I thought of Eleanor Whitaker. The 7 community assets technically belonged to the estate of her late husband, but she was the one who relied on the income. Brenda managed it, but it was her legacy. If Derek was siphoning money out of the operating accounts with fake repairs, he wasn't just stealing from a faceless corporation. He was stealing from the woman who sat on her porch and taught me how to listen to dripping faucets. I closed the file on my computer. The office was quiet. The hum of the server room the only sound. I felt a shift inside me. The soldier was waking up. The analyst was clocking in. I wasn't the little girl waiting for a pat on the head anymore. I was a professional hunter of discrepancies. And I had a feeling that if I looked closely at the Whispering Pines books, I was going to find a lot more than just a dripping sink. I picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor's number. It was time to ask some questions. Not as a neighbor, but as an auditor. The phone call came on a rainy Sunday morning. The kind of gray, listless day where the sky seems to press down on the rooftops. I was in my apartment in Fairview City, drinking black coffee and reviewing a zoning map for a client when Eleanor Whitaker's name flashed on my screen. She never called early. She was a woman of strict social protocols who believed that disturbing someone before noon on a weekend was a cardinal sin. When I answered, her voice was not the steel-reinforced sound I was used to. It was thin. It wavered like a radio signal losing its connection. "Avery, if you are not busy, could you come out to the model home? I have some papers here. I am looking at them and I don't think I am reading them right." I drove out immediately. Eleanor Whitaker had moved to the original model home on the lake about 5 years ago, leaving the main clubhouse operations to Brenda. It was her retreat. It was quiet there, surrounded by pines and the lap of water against the dock. When I arrived, the house smelled of lavender and old paper. She was sitting at her small dining table, wrapped in a knitted shawl, despite it being a mild day. Spread out before her were 2 distinct stacks of documents. On the left was a chaotic pile of receipts and handwritten ledgers, Derek's system. On the right was a neat stack of bank statements from the trust account. "Make yourself some tea, dear," she said, gesturing to the kitchen. She didn't look up. Her finger was tracing a line on one of the bank statements. I poured a cup and sat opposite her. I didn't ask what was wrong. I waited. She pushed the piles toward me. "Brenda says Derek is doing a wonderful job managing the amenities," she said. Her voice was neutral, devoid of emotion, which was far more terrifying than if she had been angry. "She says the profits are down because the market is tough and the facilities are old. She says repairs are eating up the margin." She looked at me, her eyes sharp and clear behind her reading glasses. "I may be 80 years old, Avery, and I may not know how to use that iPad you bought me very well, but I know how to add and subtract. Take a look." I pulled the stack toward me. My analyst brain clicked on instantly. I wasn't the neighbor anymore. I was the auditor. The first thing I noticed was the lack of professional formatting. Derek's reports were glorified spreadsheets printed on plain paper, some even handwritten on legal pads. I started cross-referencing. I looked at the income column for the last 6 months. Then I looked at the expense column. Here, I said, pointing to a line item from February. Clubhouse roof patch, $3,000. I flipped 2 pages forward to April. Clubhouse roof patch, $3,500. I looked at June. Emergency roof repair, clubhouse, $2,000. I looked up at Eleanor. He has paid to patch the same roof 3 times in 5 months. If a roof needs that much patching, you replace the roof and look at the vendor. It just said cash handyman scrolled in Derek's handwriting. No invoice number, no company letterhead. Keep looking, Eleanor said softly. I turned my attention to the occupancy logs. My eyes landed on the property at Maple Crest Park. It was a nice 3-acre greenbelt, one of the best in the portfolio, according to Derek's ledger. It had been vacant under renovation for the last 90 days. That meant 0 rental income flowing into Eleanor's account for 3 months. He says the paths needed to be redone, and they had trouble finding a contractor, Eleanor explained. That is 3 months of lost revenue, nearly $5,000. I frowned. If it is under renovation, there should be contractor invoices. There aren't any yet, she said. He says he is negotiating. I reached for the pile of bank statements. I found the utility bill for Maple Crest. The accounts were still in Eleanor's name, so the bills came to her, even if Derek was supposed to pay them. I looked at the water usage graph for the last 3 months. If a park is vacant, the water usage should be near 0, maybe a little for cleaning or keeping the pipes from freezing, but effectively flat. The graph for Maple Crest was a mountain range. 5,000 gallons in March, 4,000 in April, 6,000 in May. Eleanor, I said, my voice tight. Nobody uses 6,000 gallons scrubbing paths. Someone is showering there. Someone is doing laundry. Someone is washing dishes. I looked at the electric bill. The usage spiked in the evenings and on weekends. There is a family living in that park pavilion, I said, the realization settling in my stomach like a stone. Derek rented it out. He's collecting the check probably in cash and pocketing it. He is telling you it is empty so he doesn't have to deposit the money into the estate account. I sat back feeling sick. It wasn't just bad management. It wasn't just laziness. It was theft. Cold, calculated theft from his own community founder. Eleanor Whitaker didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a brief second, as if a sudden headache had struck her, and then opened them again. I thought so, she whispered. We should hire an external forensic accountant, I said, my professional instincts taking over. I can recommend a firm in the city. They can pull the records, interview the residents, and build a case. We can prove he is embezzling. Eleanor shook her head slowly. She reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was firm. No, she said. I don't want a scandal, Avery. I don't want police cars in the driveway. I don't want to spend my last years fighting a war with my own board president and her son. But they are stealing from you, I argued, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. You can't just let them do it. I am not going to let them do it, she said. But I am not going to fight them with noise. I am going to fight them with paper. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening lake. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the water. I need a keeper, she said, her back to me. I don't need a lawyer to argue for me in court. I need someone to hold the keys. Someone who knows the difference between a roof patch and a robbery. She turned back to face me. The silhouette of her small frame looked surprisingly formidable against the twilight. Tell me about your job, Avery. Specifically, what do you do when you find a company that is bleeding money? We stop the bleeding, I said. We restructure. We change the controls. We put in a manager who answers to the board. not to themselves. And the taxes? She asked. What happens if these cash payments Derek is taking aren't reported? The IRS comes after the owner, I said. That means you. If he gets caught, you are the one on the hook for tax evasion. She nodded, absorbing this. So I need to move the ownership. I need to put the assets somewhere safe, somewhere he can't touch. She walked back to the table and sat down. Her expression was intense, focused. I have been reading about trusts, she said. Revocable living trusts. If I put the assets in a trust, they don't go through probate when I die. Correct. Brenda wouldn't get to stand in front of a judge and simply claim them. That is right, I said, surprised by her research. If they are in a trust, the successor trustee takes over immediately. The bylaws become irrelevant regarding those assets. And the trustee? She asked, locking eyes with me. Does it have to be family? Does it have to be Brenda? No, I said. It can be anyone you appoint, anyone you trust to follow your instructions. The silence stretched between us. I knew what she was asking. I knew the weight of the burden she was about to place on my shoulders. If I accepted this, I wasn't just helping her with paperwork. I was declaring a silent war on Brenda and Derek. I was stepping out of the shadows and standing directly in their path. Avery, she said softly, you have the sight. You see the water bill and you know what it means. Brenda sees the water bill and she just sees a piece of paper to file away. If no one with clear eyes holds on to the papers, everything I built, everything my husband built will slide right into the hands of the loudest person in the room. And Derek is very, very loud. I looked down at the fraudulent ledger. I thought about Derek driving his new golf cart bought with the money that should have fixed Mrs. Higgins's fence. I thought of Brenda's arrogance, her absolute certainty that she owned the neighborhood. If I do this, I said, my voice trembling slightly, it will break the community. Eleanor, when they find out, they will never forgive me. Brenda will explode. Eleanor Whitaker smiled. A sad, wise smile that broke my heart. Oh, honey, she said, the community is already broken. A neighborhood where a son steals from the founder and a president cheers him on is not whole. It is just glued together with silence. She leaned forward. The truth doesn't break communities, Avery. It just reveals the cracks that are already there. The question is, are you brave enough to let the light in? I looked at her. I saw the woman who had taught me that a neighborhood is for people, not for power. I saw the only person in the world who had ever told me I was worth something. Yes, I said. I am brave enough. Good, she said, patting my hand. Then you can take these files and on Tuesday you and I are going to see a lawyer. Not Mr. Caldwell. I found a woman in the next county. She specializes in difficult estates. I stayed for dinner. We didn't talk about the fraud again. We talked about the lake and my job and the books we were reading, but the air had changed. We were conspirators now. I drove back to Fairview City late that night. The road was dark, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the pine forests. My mind was racing. For years, I had told myself that my distance was a shield. I told myself that by staying away, by not engaging with Brenda and Derek, I was protecting myself. I thought I was taking the high road. But as I drove, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, I realized that my silence had been permission. By not looking, I had let Derek feast on the residence. By walking away, I had left Eleanor Whitaker alone with the wolves. Brenda thought I was invisible. She thought I was weak because I didn't shout. I looked at the passenger seat where the stack of bank statements sat in a plastic folder. I wasn't invisible. I was camouflage and they were never going to see me coming. 3 days later, I took a personal day from Valoran. I didn't tell my boss why. I just said I had a family legal matter to attend to, which was ironically the most honest thing I had said in weeks. I drove to pick up Eleanor Whitaker at 9 in the morning. She was dressed in her Sunday best, a navy blue dress suit, and a string of pearls that Brenda had tried to convince her to sell years ago. She looked like she was going to church, but her grip on her handbag suggested she was going to war. We didn't go to Mr. Caldwell's office in downtown Whispering Pines. Caldwell was a fixture of Brenda's world. He played golf at the same club, drank the same scotch, and undoubtedly shared the same dismissive opinion of women in business. Instead, we drove 30 miles south to a nondescript office park in a neighboring county. The sign on the door read Navarro Associates Estate Planning and Elder Law. MS. Navarro was everything Caldwell was not. She was young, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and a desk that was organized with surgical precision. She didn't offer us coffee or make small talk about the weather. She had the files Eleanor had sent over already spread out on her desk. Mrs. Whitaker, MS. Navarro said, greeting Eleanor with a nod. And this must be Avery. She looked at me, assessing. It wasn't a warm look, but it was respectful. It was the look of a general inspecting a new lieutenant. I have reviewed your request, Mrs. Whitaker, Navarro began, tapping a thick stack of documents. You want to establish a revocable living trust, and you want to transfer the titles of your real estate assets into that trust immediately. That is correct, Eleanor said, sitting with perfect posture. And you understand the difference between this and bylaws? Navarro asked. It was a test. She needed to ensure Eleanor was competent. Bylaws are a letter you write to a judge asking him to please give your things away after you are dead, Eleanor said sharply. And while the judge is deciding, Brenda will be arguing and Derek will be spending money he doesn't have. A trust is different. A trust happens now. Navarro smiled. It was a genuine smile. Exactly. Think of the trust as a box. Right now you hold the assets in your hands. If you die holding them, they fall to the floor and the court has to pick them up. Today we are going to put the assets inside the box. You hold the box. When you pass, you just hand the key to Avery. The box doesn't fall. The court doesn't get involved. And most importantly, Brenda doesn't get a say. She turned to me. Avery, you are being named the successor trustee. That means the moment Eleanor is incapacitated or passes away, you step into her shoes. You don't own the assets for yourself to buy a yacht. You own the legal responsibility to manage them according to the rules of the trust. Do you understand? I do, I said. I am the fiduciary. Good, Navarro said. Now, let's look at the assets. She pulled out 7 distinct documents. These were quitclaim deeds. We have the pool on Brookline Terrace. She listed the clubhouse on Pine Hollow, the 3 parks on Riverbend Lane, the Maple Crest Greenbelt, the 2 pavilions on Elm Street. As she read the addresses, I felt a cold sweat prickle on the back of my neck. These weren't just amenities. These were the crown jewels of the Whispering Pines identity. Brenda built her entire self-worth around being the manager of these assets. Derek was currently driving around the neighborhood acting like he owned them. We are going to sign these deeds today, Navarro explained. They transfer the property from Eleanor Whitaker individual to Eleanor Whitaker, trustee of the Whitaker Living Trust. Once we record these with the county, the legal owner of the property is the trust. Not you, Eleanor, the trust. The week leading up to the reading of the bylaws was not spent grieving. I had done my grieving by the lake with Eleanor Whitaker while she was still alive. This week was spent on logistics. It was spent preparing for a demolition. My apartment in Fairview City looked less like a home and more like a war room. My dining table was buried under stacks of paper, each pile representing a different weapon in the arsenal I was building. I treated this exactly like a high-stakes audit at Valoran. In my line of work, you do not go into a meeting with a hunch. You go in with data so undeniable that the other side has no choice but to surrender. I started with the physical evidence. I had the originals of the trust documents and the 7 quitclaim deeds. These were the holy grail. I took them to a professional print shop and made 3 high-resolution copies of everything. One set went into a safety deposit box at a bank across the street from my office. That was my failsafe. If my apartment burned down, if my car was stolen, if Brenda somehow physically wrestled the papers away from me, the truth would still exist in a vault that required a biometric scan to open. The second set went onto 2 encrypted USB drives. One drive went on my keychain. The other went into the small black fireproof suitcase that sat by my front door. The suitcase was the centerpiece of my plan. It was nondescript, scuffed at the corners, the kind of luggage you carry on a cheap flight. But inside, I organized the files with ruthless efficiency. I used color-coded tabs. Green for the trust, red for the deeds, blue for the financials. I spent 2 nights building the blue section. This was the forensic accounting of Derek's theft. I pulled the bank statements Eleanor had given me and the chaotic ledgers Derek had submitted. I built a master spreadsheet that tracked every single dollar that had entered and left the estate accounts over the last 5 years. The data was damning. I created a graph overlaying the emergency repairs against the local weather reports. Derek had billed the estate $4,000 for storm damage roof repair on a week where the weather in Whispering Pines had been 70 degrees and sunny. He had billed for frozen pipe replacement in mid-September. I printed these graphs on heavy cardstock. They were simple, visual, and impossible to argue with. I wasn't just going to tell them Derek was a thief. I was going to show them the receipts. But I needed more than just internal documents. I needed the world to confirm my reality. I logged into the county's public records database. It is amazing what people ignore because they are too arrogant to look. I searched for Eleanor Whitaker. The results populated the screen instantly. There they were. 7 entries dated 3 years ago. Grantor Eleanor Whitaker. Grantee the Whitaker Living Trust. Status recorded. Valid. I downloaded every single digital receipt. Each one had a unique recording number and a digital timestamp. These proved that the transfer wasn't some secret backroom deal. It was a matter of public law. Mr. Caldwell, the HOA attorney, could have found this in 30 seconds if he had bothered to do a title search. But he hadn't. He assumed that because he wrote the bylaws, he controlled the assets. That arrogance was his fatal flaw, and I was going to exploit it. Then, I did something that wasn't in the original plan. It came to me at 3 in the morning, while I was staring at a tax return Brenda had filed for the estate 2 years ago. Brenda and Derek had been deducting these fake repairs as business expenses to lower the tax bill for the estate. They were using stolen money to commit tax fraud. If I exposed them at the reading, their first move would be to try and rewrite the books. They would claim it was a clerical error or a family loan. They would try to pay it back quietly to make the problem go away. I needed to cut off their retreat. I opened a secure browser and navigated to the State Department of Revenue's whistleblower portal. I didn't use my name. I didn't need to. I simply uploaded a PDF containing the spreadsheet of the fake repairs and the corresponding tax deductions. I wrote a brief note. Discrepancies in expense reporting for Whispering Pines HOA. Suggest audit of repair vendors. I hit send. I wasn't doing it to send Brenda to jail, though that was a possibility. I was doing it to freeze the battlefield. Once the state had the file, Brenda couldn't fix it. She couldn't claim it was a mistake. The record was locked. If they tried to fight me, they would be fighting a war on 2 fronts. One with me and one with the government. With the paper trail secured, I needed a human element. Documents are cold. I needed a voice that could cut through the emotional manipulation Brenda would inevitably use. I thought about who had been there 3 years ago, who had driven Eleanor to the lawyer's office on the day I couldn't get off work. Noah. Noah was my cousin on my mother's side. He was 24, quiet, and worked as a mechanic like me. The neighborhood largely ignored him because he didn't have a prestige career, but Eleanor had loved him. She used to bring him cookies at the garage. I called him and asked to meet at a diner halfway between Fairview and Whispering Pines. Noah looked nervous when he slid into the booth. He was wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "Is this about the memorial?" he asked. "I saw you left early." "It is about the bylaws," I said. "Noah, do you remember driving Eleanor to a law office in Oak County about 3 years ago?" "Not Caldwell's office. A different one." Noah nodded slowly, dipping a fry into ketchup. "Yeah, Ms. Navarro. I remember. Eleanor made me promise not to tell Brenda." "Do you remember how she was acting that day?" I asked. "Was she confused? Did she seem like she didn't know what she was doing?" Noah scoffed. "Eleanor confused? No way. She spent the whole car ride lecturing me on why I should open my own shop instead of working for a chain. She was sharp as a tack. She was singing along to the radio." I leaned forward. "Noah, on Sunday they are going to try to say that Eleanor was senile. They are going to say she didn't know what she was signing. I need to know if you are willing to say what you just told me in front of everyone." Noah stopped eating. He looked out the window, then back at me. He knew what I was asking. He knew that standing with me meant standing against Brenda, the president who controlled the neighborhood dynamic. "They are trying to cut you out, aren't they?" Noah asked. "They are trying to give everything to Derek," I corrected, "including things that don't belong to him." Noah wiped his mouth. He looked angry. "Derek called me last week. Asked if I could fix the transmission on his golf cart for free. Said he would put in a good word for me with the board. Like I am a servant." He looked me in the eye. "I will be there, Avery. Eleanor was the only one who treated me like a person. I won't let them lie about her." "Thank you," I said. "Don't sit with me. Sit in the back. Just be ready." The final piece of the puzzle was the enemy intelligence. I needed to know exactly who I was walking into the room with. I spent an afternoon digging into Mr. Caldwell. It wasn't hard. He was a small-town lawyer with a website that hadn't been updated since 2005. I found his client list in some old court filings. He represented Brenda's construction firm. He represented the country club board. He represented Derek for a DUI charge that had miraculously disappeared 4 years ago. He wasn't an estate specialist. He was a fixer for local people with power. Crucially, I found no record of him ever billing Eleanor Whitaker directly. All the invoices for estate planning had gone to Brenda Hargrove. That was a massive conflict of interest. A lawyer cannot ethically draft bylaws for a client if the primary beneficiary is the one paying the bill and directing the terms. It was weak lawyering. It was lazy, and it was going to be his undoing. I debated hiring my own lawyer to walk into the reading with me. I could have brought Ms. Navarro. She offered to come. She said it would be safer, but I declined. If I walked in with a lawyer, Brenda would put her guard up. Caldwell would shut down the meeting and claim he needed to review things in private. They would circle the wagons. I didn't want a negotiation. I wanted an ambush. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to feel victorious. I wanted them to stand up, clap for themselves, and believe they had won, because the fall is only fatal if you are standing at the very top. I sent a text to Ms. Navarro. "I am going in alone. If things go sideways, I need you on standby to verify the trust details over speakerphone, but only if I call." She replied instantly. "Phone is charged. Good luck, trustee." On Saturday morning, the day before the reading, the mail arrived. It was a heavy cream envelope with gold lettering. "The Hargrove family invites you to a celebration of the legacy of Eleanor Whitaker and a toast to the future of Whispering Pines HOA. It wasn't a legal notice. It was a party invitation. They had turned a legal proceeding into a coronation for Derek. They were so confident that I had been neutralized that they were inviting neighbors to watch the transfer of power. I turned the envelope over. On the back flap in Brenda's looping cursive was a handwritten note. Avery, please come for the food and to see the family. Don't worry about the business talk. We have everything settled, so you can just relax and be a guest. Love, Brenda. Just be a guest. That was the role they had assigned me for 32 years. The guest, the observer, the extra in the movie of Derek's life. I walked over to the suitcase. I unlocked the latches. Click, click. I placed the invitation inside, right on top of the quitclaim deeds. I looked at the note one last time. Everything settled, she had written. I traced the words with my finger, and for the first time in a week I let myself feel something other than cold calculation. I felt a thrill, a dark electric thrill. You are right, Brenda, I whispered to the empty room. Everything is settled. You just don't know who settled it. I closed the suitcase. I spun the combination lock. I was ready. The bomb was built. The fuse was cut. All I had to do now was walk into that clubhouse and strike the match. The Sunday of the reading dawned with an aggressive, cheerful brightness that felt like a personal insult. The sky over Whispering Pines was a piercing cloudless blue, and the birds were singing with a manic energy that completely failed to match the gravity of a legal proceeding. It was the kind of weather reserved for weddings and graduations, not for the dismembering of a founder's estate. I arrived at the clubhouse at 1 o'clock sharp. The street was already lined with cars. There were luxury sedans belonging to Brenda's golf buddies parked next to the rusted pickup trucks of the residents. It was a visual representation of the feudal system Brenda had constructed. The lords and the serfs, all gathered together to watch the crown prince ascend the throne. This was not a solemn gathering. I realized that the moment I stepped out of my car. There was no hush of mourning. There was laughter drifting from the open front door. There was the clinking of glassware. I walked up the driveway, the wheels of my black fireproof suitcase rumbling low and steady against the pavement. To anyone watching, I looked like a traveler who had just arrived from the airport. To me, the sound of those wheels was the drumbeat of an approaching army. When I entered the foyer, the first thing I saw was the poster. It was displayed on a heavy oak easel right in the center of the entryway where you couldn't miss it. It was professionally printed on glossy foam board at least 3 feet tall. At the top in gold serif font it read, Whispering Pines HOA A New Era. Below the text was a stylized map of the county with the 7 community assets marked by golden stars, and superimposed over the map, fading in like a ghost, was a large high-resolution photo of Derek. He was wearing a hard hat and holding a blueprint, looking off into the middle distance with a visionary expression. It was a photo staged 3 months ago for a local business magazine. It was tacky. It was arrogant. And it told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't invited these people to hear bylaws. They had invited them to a coronation. Avery! Brenda appeared from the crowd before I could even take my hand off the suitcase handle. She was wearing a floral dress that was far too festive for someone who had buried the founder 5 days ago. She smelled of hairspray and nervous energy. She enveloped me in a hug that felt more like a restraint than an embrace. Her arms pinned mine to my sides as if she were checking for weapons. I am so glad you came, she whispered into my ear, her voice tight. I was so worried you were going to stay away after the breakfast incident. Thank you for being the bigger person. Honey, really? Today is about unity. Unity. That was her favorite word in the Hargrove dictionary. Unity meant everyone standing in a circle and applauding Brenda. I wouldn't miss it, Brenda, I said, extricating myself from her grip. She looked down at the suitcase. Her smile faltered for a split second. Oh, she said. Did you bring luggage? Are you staying the night? Just some papers, I said vaguely. Work stuff. I didn't want to leave it in the car. Right? Right? She nodded, eager to accept any explanation that didn't cause a scene. Well, come in. Everyone is here. There is shrimp cocktail in the dining room. I walked into the main hall, dragging my heavy cargo behind me. The furniture had been rearranged to create an audience seating area facing the podium where a heavy mahogany table had been set up like a judge's bench. Brenda was standing near the podium holding a glass of champagne. She looked powerful. She was laughing at a joke told by one of the neighbors, her head thrown back, her chest expanded. When she saw me, she didn't smile. Her eyes flicked to the suitcase, narrowed with suspicion, and then reverted to a look of guarded tolerance. She excused herself from the neighbor and walked over to me. "You made it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did," I replied. She gestured to the bag with her glass. "Planning to move back in? That is a big case for an afternoon visit." "Just brought some files," I said, keeping my voice light. "I have to head back to the city right after we are done. Didn't want to risk a break-in with my laptop in the car." "Smart," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice so the guests wouldn't hear. "Listen, Avery, I appreciate you coming. I know we had words the other day, but let's keep today smooth. All right? These are important people. Investors, partners. Don't embarrass your neighbor Derek." "I have no intention of embarrassing anyone who doesn't deserve it," I said. She took that as agreement. She patted my shoulder, 2 hard thumps, and moved away to greet a local councilman. I retreated to the back of the room, finding a spot near a bookshelf where I could observe the terrain. Derek was working the room like a seasoned politician. He was wearing a navy blue suit that was tailored a little too tight, meant to show off his gym physique. His girlfriend, Madison, was attached to his arm like a barnacle. She was beaming, accepting congratulations from everyone she passed. "Oh, we are thinking of renovating the Maple Crest Park first," I heard her tell Mrs. Gable, the town librarian. "The paths are just so dated. We want to put in quartz gravel and raise the dues to market rate." I felt a flash of cold anger. The Maple Crest Park, the one where she thought she was going to put in quartz gravel, was the same park where Derek was currently hiding a family and stealing the rent. She didn't know. She had no idea she was dating a fraud. She just saw the New Era poster and saw dollar signs. I scanned the crowd. I needed to know exactly who was here. I counted 32 people. There were the neighbors, mostly older couples who had known Eleanor for decades, but had known Brenda longer. They were here for the gossip and the free food. There were a few distant acquaintances who looked bored, checking their phones, and then there were the residents. This was the part that turned my stomach. Brenda had invited 3 of the long-term residents. Mr. and Mrs. Higgins were there holding plates of food awkwardly, looking out of place in their work clothes. They looked grateful. They looked at Brenda and Derek with respect, probably thinking that being invited to the president's house was a great honor. They didn't know that the administrative fee Derek charged them every month was illegal. They didn't know that the reason their fence leaked wasn't because parts were on back order, but because Derek had pocketed the repair money. And in the back corner, sitting quietly near the window, was Noah. My cousin caught my eye. He gave a barely perceptible nod. He was wearing a clean button-down shirt, his hands folded in his lap. He looked terrified, but he was there. He was my anchor. The front door opened again and the room quieted slightly. Mr. Caldwell had arrived. He bustled in with the self-importance of a man who believes he carries the tablets of Moses in his leather satchel. He was sweating slightly from the heat, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He shook Brenda's hand vigorously, nodded to Derek, and ignored everyone else. He looked confident. Why wouldn't he be? In his mind, this was a routine job. He had drafted the bylaws based on Brenda's instructions. He had drafted a waiver that he assumed I would eventually sign. He believed he was about to read a document that would seamlessly transfer millions of dollars of community assets to the male heir, cementing his relationship with the new boss. He didn't know he was walking into a trap. "Sorry I'm late," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying. Had to notarize a few last-minute items, but we are all set. Excellent, Brenda said. She clapped her hands loudly. All right, everyone. If we could all gather around, please take a seat. We have plenty of chairs. The room shuffled. People moved toward the rows of folding chairs that had been set up facing the heavy table. The atmosphere shifted from cocktail party to theater audience. I didn't sit. I stayed in the back, standing by the bookshelf, my hand resting on the handle of my suitcase. Brenda took her place at the front of the room, standing next to the easel with Derek's face on it. She waited for the murmurs to die down. She looked at her husband, who gave her a teary, encouraging smile. She looked at her son, who stood with his chest puffed out. She didn't look at me. Thank you all for coming, Brenda began. Her voice was rich, practiced. We lost a great woman this week. Eleanor Whitaker was the matriarch of this community. She was a woman of vision. She started with one small house and built it into what you see today. She gestured to the map. But Eleanor knew that a legacy isn't just about holding on to the past. It is about building for the future. She knew that for this HOA to thrive, needed strong, young leadership. It needed energy. She placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. Derek tried to look humble and failed completely. My husband and I talked about this often in her final years, Brenda lied. She said it so smoothly. She told me, Brenda, make sure Derek is ready. Make sure he has the tools. Well, folks, I am proud to say he is ready. There was a smattering of applause. Madison clapped the loudest, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. So today, Brenda continued, we are going to make it official. We are going to read the final wishes of Eleanor Whitaker, which will transition the stewardship of Whispering Pines HOA to the next generation, to Derek. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. And I want to say, she added, her tone shifting slightly, becoming dismissive, that we are also glad my neighbor Avery could join us from the city. She waved a hand vaguely in my direction, not even making eye contact. Avery has her own life. She has her own career. She has never had much interest in the dirt and grit of property management, and that is fine. We are proud of her independence. But today is about the business. Today is about the Hargrove name staying on the deeds. It was a masterstroke of exclusion in 3 sentences. She had defined me as an outsider, praised me for being irrelevant, and erased my claim to the community name. So, Brenda finished, stepping back. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Caldwell to read the last will and testament. The applause was polite but brief. The guests sensed the shift. The party was over. The legal part was beginning. Mr. Caldwell sat down at the heavy mahogany table. He placed his leather briefcase in front of him. The room went silent. You could hear the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. You could hear the breathing of 30 people. I watched him. I watched his hands. He clicked the gold latches of his briefcase. Click, click. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It was the exact same sound my suitcase had made when I locked it that morning. He opened the lid. He reached in and pulled out a thick document bound in blue paper. Thank you, Brenda, Caldwell said, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked over the rims at the audience. He looked satisfied. This will be brief. The terms are quite straightforward. He cleared his throat. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase. My knuckles were white. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A frantic, heavy rhythm. They were so sure. They were so incredibly, stupidly sure. Brenda crossed her arms, leaning against the mantel, looking at her son with pride. Derek winked at his girlfriend. Brenda's husband wiped his eyes. They thought the story was over. They thought the ending had been written, signed, and filed. I took a silent breath, expanding my lungs, preparing my voice. Mr. Caldwell opened the first page of the will. I, Eleanor Whitaker, being of sound mind and body, he began. I let him finish the sentence. I let the silence hang for 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then I pushed off the wall. I took a step forward, the wheels of my suitcase rolling on the hardwood floor. The sound cut through the room like a knife. The show was about to begin. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, a wet guttural sound that seemed amplified in the hushed room. He adjusted his reading glasses, sliding them down the bridge of his sweaty nose, and began to read from the blue-bound document with a tone of self-importance that grated against my nerves. Article 3, he announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room. Distribution of real property. I watched him closely. I watched his eyes scan the page, interpreting words that he believed were the final edict of Eleanor Whitaker. I, Eleanor Whitaker, he read, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my real estate holdings, specifically the residential rental portfolio managed under the Hargrove family name, to my grandson Derek Hargrove. A ripple went through the room, a soft collective exhale. This bequest includes, Caldwell continued, listing the addresses I knew by heart. The properties at 42 Brookline Terrace, 108 Pine Hollow, the triplex on Riverbend Lane. He rattled them off. 7 addresses, 7 streams of income, 7 homes filled with families. This decision is made in recognition of Derek's tireless dedication, Caldwell read, stumbling slightly over a smudge on the paper, and his role as my primary caretaker and the steward of my business affairs during my final years. I felt a sharp cold spike in my chest. Primary caretaker? Derek hadn't visited Eleanor for a non-business reason in 5 years. He hadn't driven her to a doctor's appointment. He hadn't brought her groceries. He hadn't sat with her on the porch and watched the sunset. That phrase, primary caretaker, was not Eleanor's voice. It was Brenda's. I could hear Brenda's cadence in the sentence structure. Eleanor never used the word steward. She called it keeping house. Brenda couldn't wait any longer. The legal pacing was too slow for her ego. She stepped away from the mantel, effectively cutting Caldwell off mid-sentence. Thank you, Arthur. Brenda boomed, taking over the floor. I think we can summarize the rest. Caldwell looked annoyed but deferred to the woman who paid his invoices. He lowered the document. Brenda looked out at the audience, her face flushed with victory. We all know what Eleanor wanted, Brenda declared. She was a traditional woman. She believed in keeping the family name on the deeds, and frankly, she knew who had the grit to handle the pressure. She placed a heavy hand on Derek's shoulder again. Derek beamed, looking down at his shoes with a practiced modesty that fooled everyone but me. All 7 community assets will go into Derek's name immediately, Brenda announced. He is the new face of Whispering Pines HOA. Then she turned her head slightly. She didn't look at me. She looked past me at the wall behind my head. As for my neighbor Avery, she said, her voice taking on a benevolent, dismissive tone. My husband and I discussed this at length. Avery has her own life in the city. She has a career. She is independent. She said the word independent like it was a diagnosis. She doesn't need the burden of managing residents, Brenda said, shrugging. And she certainly doesn't need the money. She is doing just fine on her own. So, in accordance with the will, the HOA business remains intact with Derek. Avery receives our love and our pride, which is what she has always wanted. She smiled, a wide shark-like expression. Our neighbor doesn't need a share, she added, repeating a phrase she often used with her friends, framing my disinheritance as a compliment to my resilience. The room erupted. This time, the applause was louder than before. It was validated. The tension was broken. The neighbors nodded to one another, murmuring their approval. That makes sense, I heard Mrs. Gable whisper. Derek is the one who lives here. Avery is so smart. Another acquaintance said loud enough for me to hear. She probably makes a fortune at that analytics firm. She doesn't need Eleanor's money. They looked at me, but they didn't see a victim. They saw a woman who had been successfully pruned from the community tree to let the main branch grow stronger. Their eyes held a mix of pity and judgment. Pity because I was left out. Judgment because they assumed I didn't care. Brenda's husband was standing just behind Brenda. He reached out and squeezed Derek's arm. His eyes were wet with tears. He looked at his son with a burning, terrifying pride. He wasn't crying for the dead founder. He was crying because his baby boy had finally won. He had spent his life mediating, smoothing over cracks, and ensuring this exact moment happened to him. This wasn't theft. It was order. I sat perfectly still. My hands were resting on the handle of the black suitcase. My heart rate, which had been thumping hard earlier, began to slow down. Thump, thump, thump. It was the calm of the sniper before the shot. It was the absolute clarity of knowing the outcome before the dice stopped rolling. They were celebrating a fiction. They were clapping for a ghost story. Mr. Caldwell, sensing the climax of the event, tapped his papers on the table to straighten them. Well, the lawyer said, looking at his watch, I believe that concludes the reading of the primary assets. I have the transfer documents here for Derek to sign. We can get the notary over here in a few minutes and wrap this up. He reached for his pen. He was about to close the blue folder. He was about to seal the lie. The applause died down. People started to shift in their chairs, ready to head back to the buffet for more shrimp cocktail. Brenda was already turning to shake the hand of the councilman. I stood up. I didn't do it quickly. I didn't jump. I stood up slowly, deliberately, unfurling my height until I was the tallest thing in the back of the room. I pulled the handle of my suitcase. The wheels groaned slightly on the wood. Excuse me, I said. My voice wasn't a shout, but it cut through the chatter like a razor blade. Brenda froze. She turned slowly, her smile tightening into a grimace. Derek looked up, annoyed. Brenda's husband put a hand to his mouth. If everything is clearly settled, I said, walking out from the shadow of the bookshelf into the center aisle, then I just have one question. The room went dead silent. The neighbors turned in their seats. They had forgotten I was there. They had bought the narrative that I was the cool, distant neighbor who was fine with everything. They weren't expecting a scene. I stopped in the middle of the room. I was 10 feet away from the table where Caldwell sat. I was surrounded by 30 people who wanted me to sit down and shut up. I didn't look at Brenda. I didn't look at Derek. I didn't look at her husband. I locked my eyes onto Mr. Caldwell. He looked up at me, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked confused. He was a man who was used to deference, used to being the smartest person in the room by default. Avery, Brenda barked, stepping forward. What are you doing? We are done here. I ignored her. I kept my gaze fixed on the lawyer. Lawyer, I said. I let the word hang there. I stripped him of his name. I stripped him of his status. I reduced him to his function. You really don't know, do you? The question hit the room with the force of a physical blow. It was so calm, so genuinely curious that it was terrifying. Mr. Caldwell blinked. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down at his papers, then back up at me. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. He was a bad lawyer, but he had been in the game long enough to know the scent of danger. Pardon me, Caldwell stammered. Now what? Ms. Thompson. He started flipping through the pages of the will he had just read, his fingers fumbling. He was checking for a missing page. He was checking for a catch. He thought the trap was in his briefcase. What is she talking about? Derek demanded, standing up. Avery, Sit down. You're ruining the party. You don't know, I repeated to Caldwell, my voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, deadlier. You stood up here and read bylaws transferring 7 assets. You accepted a fee to draft that document. And you really truly have no idea what you just did. The silence in the room was suffocating. The air conditioner hummed. A fly buzzed against the window pane. Brenda's face turned a deep, violent shade of red. She marched toward me. That is enough, she shouted. You are embarrassing this community. You are embarrassing yourself. I told you if you pull a stunt. It is not a stunt. Brenda, I said, not breaking eye contact with the lawyer. It is a malpractice suit waiting to happen. Caldwell went pale. He stopped flipping pages. He looked at Brenda. Then he looked at me. He saw the suitcase. Brenda, Caldwell whispered, his voice trembling. Brenda, what is she doing? She is leaving, Brenda yelled. She reached out to grab my arm. I didn't flinch. I didn't back away. I reached down to the suitcase. Click. I unlocked the first latch. Click. I unlocked the second latch. The sound was loud in the quiet room. It sounded like the cocking of a weapon. You read the bylaws, lawyer, I said, lifting the lid of the case. Now, let me read the public record. I reached inside. My hand brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the heavy cardstock. I felt the raised gold seal of the county register on the top document. I pulled the stack of papers out. The gold seals caught the afternoon light, gleaming brightly. I held them up. You can't give away what you don't own, I said. Brenda stopped mid-step, her eyes fixed on the gold seals. She didn't know what they were yet, but she knew deep in her gut that they were the end of her world. I dropped the stack of deeds onto the table in front of Caldwell. Thud. Read the date, I commanded. I dropped the stack of documents onto the mahogany table. The sound was heavy, a dull thud that seemed to echo against the high ceilings of the clubhouse. It was the sound of a gavel coming down. Read the date, lawyer, I repeated. Mr. Caldwell stared at the papers. His hand shook slightly as he reached out to touch them. He wasn't looking at a simple will anymore. He was looking at official county-certified quitclaim deeds. The gold foil seals were raised and textured, catching the light, undeniable proof of their authenticity. He adjusted his glasses and leaned in. October 14th, 3 years ago, he read, his voice barely a whisper. Louder, I said, so the room can hear you. October 14th, 3 years ago, Caldwell announced, his voice cracking. And who is the grantor? I asked, guiding him through his own humiliation. Eleanor Whitaker, he said. And the grantee, I pressed. Who owns those assets? Mr. Caldwell. Read the line. He swallowed hard. He looked up at Brenda, then at Derek, then back at the paper. He knew that the next words he spoke would destroy his biggest client. But he also knew that if he lied about a public record in front of 60 witnesses, he would lose his license. The grantee is the Whitaker Living Trust, Caldwell read. Eleanor Whitaker, trustee. He flipped to the next page. And the successor trustee, he continued, the color draining from his face. Is Avery Thompson? The room erupted, not with applause this time, but with a collective gasp of shock. The polite murmurs of the neighbors turned into urgent whispers. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with her hand. The councilman Brenda had been trying to impress took a distinct step away from her. What is this? Brenda shouted, rushing the table. She grabbed one of the deeds, crumpling the edge. This is fake. She printed this on her computer. It is a forgery. Look at the recording number. Brenda, I said calmly. Top right corner. Book 402. Page 891. You can check it on your phone right now. It has been on the county server for 3 years. Mr. Caldwell was already checking. He had pulled out his smartphone and was frantically typing into the county database. I watched his thumb hover, then press search. He slumped back in his chair. He looked like a balloon that had been punctured. "It is real," Caldwell whispered. "It is all there. Every single property. They were transferred out of Eleanor's name 3 years ago. They are not part of the estate. They belong to the trust." "And who controls the trust?" I asked. Caldwell looked at the trust document I had placed next to the deeds. He opened it to the designated tab. "Avery Thompson is the sole successor trustee and primary beneficiary," he read. Then he paused. He squinted at a specific clause I had highlighted in yellow. "And Clause 14b specifically states that due to conflicting financial interests, Brenda Hargrove and Derek Hargrove are permanently disqualified from serving as trustees." "That is a lie," Brenda screamed. She was losing control completely, her face purple with rage. Eleanor was senile. She didn't know what she was doing. Avery dragged her to some back-alley lawyer and tricked her. She was confused. She would never cut Derek out. I didn't yell back. I didn't argue. I simply turned my head toward the back of the room. "Noah," I said. My cousin stood up. He looked terrified, his hands trembling by his sides, but he stood tall. All eyes turned to him. Brenda looked at him with a mix of confusion and betrayal. "Noah drove Eleanor to the appointment," I told the room. "Noah, tell them. Was Eleanor confused that day?" Noah cleared his throat. "No," he said. His voice was shaky at first. Then it grew stronger. "No, Brenda. She wasn't confused. She was sharp. She actually made the lawyer rewrite a page because she wanted to make sure the charity clause was correct. She said," he paused, looking at Derek. "She said she needed to protect the assets from people who treat them like ATMs. "Charity clause," Brenda snapped. "What charity clause?" I reached into my suitcase and pulled out the final deed, the one for the small pavilion on Cedar Street. "The Rodriguez family," I said, looking toward the back row where the quiet couple sat holding hands. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, could you stand up? Please." They stood, looking bewildered and frightened. "Eleanor Whitaker didn't put your pavilion in the main trust," I said, my voice softening. "She put it into the Whitaker Education Fund. The deed mandates that the dues you pay go directly into a scholarship account for Sophia's nursing degree. As long as you live there, that money pays for her college. It doesn't go to the Hargroves." Mrs. Rodriguez burst into tears. She covered her face, sobbing into her husband's shoulder. Mr. Rodriguez looked at me, then at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit, and whispered a thank you that was louder than any shout. The room was dead silent. The contrast was brutal. On one side, Brenda and Derek, greedy and grasping. On the other, a founder who had secretly funded a girl's education. "You see," I said to the room, "she wasn't senile. She was just kind, and she knew exactly who would try to undo her kindness if she didn't lock it down." I turned back to Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, "Brenda gave you bylaws to read, but bylaws only cover what a person owns when they die. Since these assets were moved into the trust 3 years ago, Eleanor Whitaker owned nothing at the time of her death. The document you are holding is a wish list for assets that don't exist." Caldwell closed the blue folder. He pushed it away from him as if it were contaminated. "She is right," Caldwell said, his voice defeated. He looked at Brenda. "Brenda, the will is valid for her personal effects, her jewelry, her furniture, but the real estate, it is gone. It is in the trust. I can't probate property that isn't in the estate." "No," Derek slammed his fist on the table. "This is mine. I have been managing those places. I have been doing the work. You can't just walk in here with a suitcase and steal my future. I am not stealing anything, Derek, I said. I am stopping you from stealing. I reached into the suitcase one last time. I pulled out the blue binder, the forensic accounting, the graphs, the weather reports. I slammed it down on the table. This, I said, pointing to the binder, is a record of every single emergency repair you billed to the estate in the last 5 years. Roof repairs during sunny weeks, pipe bursts in the summer, tens of thousands of dollars funneled into cash payments for vendors that don't exist. Derek's face went white. The bluster drained out of him instantly. He knew exactly what was in that binder. I haven't sent this to the other residents yet, I said, lying slightly about the scope of my distribution to keep the pressure on him personally. But let me be clear. If you or Brenda try to fight this trust, if you try to drag me to court, or if you ever try to pressure me to sign a waiver again, I will hand this binder to the district attorney, and you won't be fighting for a house. You will be fighting to stay out of prison for embezzlement and tax fraud. Brenda looked at the binder. She looked at the deeds. She looked at the neighbors who were now staring at her with open disgust. The New Era poster with Derek's face on it suddenly looked like a joke. She crumbled. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a pathetic desperation. Avery, she pleaded, her voice cracking. Avery, please. We are family. Brenda just wants to keep everything together. You are destroying us. Why are you doing this? Why are you ruining everything? I am not ruining anything. Brenda, I said. I am keeping the promise I made to Eleanor. She knew you would try to rewrite the story. She knew you would try to make Derek the hero. She trusted me to keep the record straight. You are a snake, Derek spat, tears of rage in his eyes. You were spying on us. You were planning this. I was paying attention, I corrected. There is a difference. I looked around the room. Brenda's husband was sitting in his chair, his face buried in his hands, weeping silently. Nobody was comforting him. The guests were awkwardly gathering their purses, desperate to leave. The party was over. Mr. Caldwell, I said, please confirm for the record right now who holds the title to the Whispering Pines community assets. Caldwell stood up. He straightened his tie. He looked at the deeds one last time. According to the official records of Oak Ridge County, Caldwell announced formally, the properties are held by the Whitaker Living Trust. Avery Thompson is the trustee. The estate has no claim. It was done. The gavel had fallen. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just closed the latches on my suitcase. Click, click. I looked at the residents. Mrs. Higgins, the Rodriguez family. Your leases are safe, I told them. The dues stay the same and the repairs will actually get done now. I will be in touch next week. I took the handle of my suitcase and turned to leave. Avery, Brenda called out, a wail of despair. Where are you going? We have to fix this. I stopped at the door. I looked back at the tableau of the board. Brenda, defeated and small. Derek, exposed as a fraud. Her husband broken by his own denial. There is nothing to fix. Brenda, I said. Eleanor didn't leave the assets to me to punish you. She left them to me so that nobody else would be used. She broke the cycle. All I did was read the paper. I walked out of the front door into the bright, blinding sunshine. The air tasted sweet. The birds were still singing, indifferent to the carnage inside. I walked to my car, loaded the suitcase into the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I looked at my hands. They were steady. Eleanor was right. Invisibility had been my weapon. They never looked at me, so they never saw the blade until it cut them. I started the engine and drove away from the clubhouse, past the New Era poster that would be in the trash by tomorrow. If someone tries to write your name out of the story, remember this. You have the right to pick up the pen. You have the right to correct the record, especially when the paper is already on the table and the truth is stamped in gold.